Music for plants. Does playing music for your plants help with plant growth? I've also heard that playing bird chirping noises helps with plant growth, whether it be I don't know if it's the stomata opening or what, but those are a couple things I've heard. What's your take on that?
It's a really interesting topic, and I'll say that the underlying logic was actually developed in the late 1980s. There was a researcher, Don Carlson, I think was his name, at University of Minnesota. I want to say, if my memory serves correctly, but anyways, a researcher in 1986 had put forward this idea that the stomata themselves could be the conductance of the stomata, meaning the opening and the closing of the stomata, could be influenced by sound frequencies. And so what he did was he exposed those plants to 3,000 hertz to 5,000 hertz, which basically mimics a bird chirp in the morning. And what he found was, over 15 years of research, I believe it was, that there is in fact a correlation between playing noises, bird chirps, maybe music even to some extent, and the overall impact that it has on the growth of the plants. I'll kind of back up one step and say that plants are remarkably sensitive to their environment. They're exceptionally capable of taking in a variety of different inputs. They're trying to measure and sense every possible nook and cranny of reality that's external to them, because again, they don't have a choice. They can't get up and move around if the environment's not ideal. So they're always trying to figure out what's going on in the environment around them. They're taking in as many data points that they possibly can. And with that being said, they are sensitive to sound waves that come through them, with specifically in reference to the way that the stomata open and close. It's less to do with the physical opening and physical closing of the stomata, and more to do with the maximum size of the stomata being opening. It's maximum conductance. How open does it actually get? Think about that like a fuel injector for a race car. If you're trying to create more horsepower inside of the system, you need those fuel injectors to squirt more fuel for every second that the engine is operational. And so this kind of effectively translates to the way that the stomata open and close, because if you have stomata opened a little bit further, even if it's a 10 to 15% increase in the conductance of the stomata, then you could theoretically achieve a 10 to 15% increase in productivity in the plants. I will say that this has been studied extensively, and it's not just like this one factor that determines it all, because ultimately photosynthesis and even stomatal conductance is driven by a very fine-tuned balancing act. Plants will open and close selectively based on a number of different things that occur. During the wintertime, the sun's still out, but maybe certain species of plants aren't growing because to them it's less about the exposure to the sun and more about what temperature it is, right? And then in some other cases, plants are very sensitive to photoperiod triggers. This is how they initiate flowering. And so there's all of these different influencing variables that ultimately kind of converge together, and that's the final response that the plant has. But if you have everything kind of dialed in, if you have good temperature, good humidity, it's very true that exposing your plants to the right frequencies can actually make a difference in their growth overall, and I think that's possible to measure. I think people maybe have taken it a little bit outside the context of how that theory was initially developed and how it's been tested, but it's certainly true to say that plants will respond to frequencies just like they respond to frequencies of light. They'll respond to frequencies of sound.
That's interesting. Yeah, I heard a couple things that relate to this singing to your plants, so kind of along the lines of playing music for your plants. But I've heard about this old wives' tale or something. It was this lady who sung to her plants, and then the other plants she didn't sing to, and she saw better growth in the plants that she sung to. Well, come to find out, it was just the carbon dioxide that she was emitting, from her exhale, that was contributing to the growth. It wasn't actually the singing that did it. So I thought that was kind of funny to bring up. I'm not sure if you've heard of that one or not.
I have, yeah.
I also wanted to bring up, in regards to playing music for your plants, that the dB would have to be crazy loud in order for it to be any impact, the equivalent of a jet engine going off. That's when, it has to be that loud in order for it to actually make an impact to the plant. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so there's a branch of science called cymatics, and it's basically the effect that sound frequencies have on the formation of, like on geometric patterns that can be formed. So the idea basically is like you've got a subwoofer and you put a little bit of salt on top of the subwoofer, and depending on what frequency is being played, it will generate a different kind of, geometry, I guess you could say. A lot of it is pretty fascinating. It's interesting to see what exactly happens, but it's certainly true that water will respond to certain types of sound frequencies. You can kind of change the geometry of water, so to speak. And so I imagine there's a similar mechanism that could actually be at play here. A lot of this stuff is very, very subtle and very nuanced. And a lot of it is just like maybe considered a little bit taboo, and we just don't have the instrumentation that's sensitive enough for us to be able to accurately measure some of this type of stuff. So the general consensus right now in the scientific community is probably that it's a little bit esoteric more than it is practical, but there have been a lot of really good research articles that have been coming out, especially recently, that kind of bridge the gaps in our understanding, because they have more sensitive machinery now that it's possible for us to make these measurements and kind of, separate the signal from the noise in some other cases. Like what you just mentioned, the singing of that this lady, she sang to her plants, it was actually the CO2 that she released, which caused the increase in yield. And so that's there's some signal there, and then there's some noise there too. And I think being able to peel it apart is what we're kind of getting to a spot of being able to do. And certainly there's good reason to think that plants are going to respond to this type of stuff. I mean, they kind of evolved, they co-evolved, they attract pollinators like birds and like other, bees, for example. And so it stands to reason that they could also, maybe there's some electromagnetic interaction there too. I think this was actually something that was determined to be true with the way that lavender interacts with bees. I guess lavender, if I recall correctly, the study was demonstrating that lavender plants emit a particular frequency. It's not something that you can hear. It's not an audible frequency, but it's still a frequency that gets emitted, and it allows the bees to navigate towards the flower that's ready to be, the nectar is ready to be harvested out of that particular flower. And when the bee harvests nectar out of that bud and it flies away, the electromagnetic frequency is no longer there. It's maybe turned off for about 1 minute to 2 minutes while that bud, the nectar kind of fills that bud. And again, I may be butchering the explanation overall of what this study demonstrated, but the idea was basically that, plants are emitting, if not noises that are audible to the human ear, there's still frequencies that they're putting out there in the surrounding space around them to try to attract these pollinators. Some of those frequencies are not compounds. We often associate attracting pollinators with the production of volatile compounds, things that we can actually smell. And this is true. It does work like that, but there's also something to be said about maybe other ways of attracting beneficial pollinators. And I think this opens up a discussion around these electromagnetic things that we're starting to be able to measure and quantify and better understand. There's something there for sure.
This clip is brought to you by Happy Hydro. For all your garden equipment needs, visit happyhydro.com, link is in the video description, and use the discount code MrGrowIt.